Chapter 13. We hunt for seal and whale in the Straits of Mozambique. The merchant, with affright aghast, when Africus, with furious blast, lashes the Icarian waves to foam, extols his quiet inland home, but safe in port he straight equips anew his tempest-battered ships, by no disaster to be taught contentment with a lowly lot. From Horace. I was happy to go aboard the Pedro Gorino once more. It seemed to me that the sea would bring rest to my tired mind, and help me to forget my disappointment. Benjamin and Braithwaite had made 2 successful trips carrying fiber and skins, as well as miscellaneous cargo. Their talk, however, was not of trade. It was centered on whaling and sealing, for they had sighted a school of humpback whales on their last voyage. They wanted to fit up the Pedro Gorino as a whaler and set sail for the Straits of Mozambique. It sounded as if it might be good sport, so I let them have their way. When I told Frater and Elliot of our proposed trip, they were enthusiastic and willing to help me all that they could, because they had more orders for whale oil, whalebone, and seal skins than they could fill, when they also realized that on each trip we could do a certain amount of freighting to Delagoa Bay, and thus help them to build up their Portuguese trade. They were willing to fit out the Pedro Gorino for her new work at their own expense. They made me a present of 2 new whaling boats, gun harpoons, and a great deal of gear for handling and disposing of the whales once we had harpooned them. The whole outfit was new and up-to-date, and we predicted an exciting and lucrative trip. We accepted freight and passengers for Delagoa Bay and made our departure from Cape Town. The weather was warm with favorable winds. We sailed north and east day after day, circling farther and farther to the northward. There was little work to do, and much time for singing and storytelling. The whole crew were like boys on a holiday because of the anticipated hunt. I determined to be happy in spite of myself, and threw my whole heart into the work and play about me. Will Braithwaite, Sidney Wilson, and Peter Benjamin shared my cabin with me. They were the greatest trio for singing chanties and spirituals I have ever known. That rhythm, that mournful melody. Way down yonder by myself, I couldn't hear nobody pray. I couldn't hear nobody pray. I couldn't hear nobody pray. Way down yonder by myself, I couldn't hear nobody pray. Then Sidney Wilson, an octave lower. I'm goin' to get shot all to pieces 'bout the girl I love. Who taught you to sing like that, brothers, sons of Ham? Dark brown bucks born under Scorpio sing, laugh, be happy. I spent my life in sorrow, and what has it profited me? I wish I were back there with you. I would sing too, sing and stamp my feet. Who built the ark? Noah, Noah. Who built the ark? Brother Noah built the ark. Before we realized it, we were at Delagoa Bay. Da Costa and 2 government officials met me at the dock and took me aside to ask me about my progress in securing permission to purchase Portuguese East Africa. They had no idea that it was lack of funds that held me in check. I still had hopes that I could secure backing from some quarter. Perhaps if my trading operations continued to be successful, I could swing the deal myself at some time in the future. My replies to their questions were evasive. I knew that my words did not satisfy them, but neither did they completely blast their hopes. While I was still a prospective buyer, they were willing to do anything to help me, and so, when they discovered that I wanted a pilot, they secured 2 of the best Portuguese in the port to aid me on my trip through the Straits of Mozambique. These 2 men knew the Indian Ocean as no others I have ever met, and handled the ship as if they had been aboard her for years. When we at last made our departure from Delagoa Bay, and got offshore of the reefs, we ran into the teeth of a wind, which was so strong as to make us change our course, and run due east. The weather was very bad for 3 or 4 days, and we were blown this way and that. We were unable to make a fix, as the cloudy heavens obscured the stars and moon and sun, and there were no points which we could shoot for our latitude and longitude. Finally, one night we got sight of Cepheus and got our bearings. We found that we were far south of Madagascar, and since the weather was clearing and the wind shifting, we now were able to shape our course northward toward Cape Sainte Marie, the southernmost point of Madagascar. We were now in waters where we might sight whale at any hour, and I gave orders for the watch in the crow's nest to keep a sharp lookout. By the time we sighted Cape Sainte Marie, the weather was very good. We commenced to sail between reefs and little desert islands in as romantic a sea as one could ask. The Portuguese knew the coast well, but we threw the lead for precaution's sake wherever we passed near islands. The sailor who had been given the task shouted, "Watch ho!" with each heave, and his voice was carried aft through the clear air. The islands themselves were very small, and for most part barren, or at best covered with scant vegetation. Some of these islands had coves, and the lookout was instructed to keep a sharp watch for any sign of life. It was about 6 bells in the morning, after we had been sailing along this type of coast for some hours, that the lookout sighted seal on one of the little islands on our starboard bow. We dropped anchor and prepared to lower 2 boats. The sea was so still that we could hear the occasional roar of the bull seals, where they lay on the opposite side of the island. Because of the intervening jagged heaps of rock, we could not see the seals from the deck, but the lookout told us that there were several hundred of them sunning themselves on the shore and swimming in the rocky cove. I was anxious to see the sport, so I accompanied the party of 10 men who manned the boats, and proceeded with muffled oars to approach the lee side of the island. We were careful not to make a sound, for if seals are alarmed, they slip quickly into the sea and swim to safety. When we reached the shore, we pulled the boats up onto the narrow sandy beach, and prepared to proceed on foot. Each of us was armed with a knobkerrie, a South African club-like weapon, some 3 feet long. These we gripped firmly as we proceeded to crawl over rock and sand toward the cove. As we came over a little rise, we saw before us the whole colony lying in the sun and swimming in the clear water. There were big bull seals and mother seals with their babies, all unaware of the sudden destruction about to descend upon them. Then one of our men accidentally loosened a little stone, which went leaping and clattering down toward the cove. The spell was broken, and the seals went plunging and sliding into the sea, and we came down upon them, striking left and right, and killing the sleek animals by the dozens. Yet to every one we killed, 10 slipped away to safety. There were perhaps 75 lying dead when we had finished. We had spared the very small seals, and we had been able to kill only 2 or 3 of the big bulls. Those we had captured were mostly females and young males. The skins are not as fine as the skins of several other varieties of seals that may be taken in other parts of the world, but when plucked and prepared, even these will bring a considerable sum in the larger cities of Europe and America. Benjamin and Braithwaite, as well as the crew, were elated with our first haul. Often a whole colony will swim to safety, so the 75 we had killed were quite a bag. The skins were carefully removed, salted, and packed away in puncheons in the hold. This seemed poor sport to me. There was money in it, no doubt, but I found little excitement in clubbing to death beasts as mild-natured as dogs. Therefore, at the next 2 islands on which we sighted seal, I stayed aboard the ship and let the crew do the killing. The next time we dropped anchor, we took 15, and at the 3rd island, which was well up the coast toward the Bay of St. Augustine, we took 60, making a total of about 150 seals in 3 stops. We had over 2 puncheons full of valuable skins. These were all that we took, however, partly because I did not like the business, and partly because our attention was mainly on whales. Some of the men tried eating the seal meat, but I thought it quite rank. We sighted St. Augustine Bay early one morning, and before the day was over, were well up the coast of Madagascar toward Tolkar. We dropped anchor at this little port, and found it to be a town of some 1,000 inhabitants. The country about the town was beautiful with hills, easy slopes, and green vegetation. The large meadow-like expanses dotted at intervals with clumps of trees and watered by occasional streams reminded me of Natal and some parts of Pondo Land. The inhabitants of this country were for the most part Negroes and mulattoes, but there were some Arabs, Somalis, Chinese, Japanese, and Hindus. Shortly after we had dropped anchor, the weather had become so rough that we were forced to await an abatement of wind and waves before we could make our departure. We had been detained for over a week when an English freighter loaded with hides, ivory, and mohair berthed a few hundred feet from us. She had just come down the straits ahead of a stiff breeze, and she was the worse for rough weather. I met her captain when he came ashore, and we struck up an acquaintanceship. I brought him aboard the Pedro Gorino, and when he saw our whaling tackle, he said, "Just ran across a school of humpbacks up the channel. Too bad I didn't have your outfit with me." That was all that was needed to set the crew wild. Even Benjamin, usually the most calm and cautious of mariners, wanted to put out to sea that night. I was able to convince him that it would be best to wait until morning, as the sea was running high. The next morning, despite the bad weather, we made our departure. For several days we were beating up the Straits of Mozambique, first on one tack, then on the other, fighting a stiff headwind all the way. The weather was chilly but bracing. We were all at a high pitch of excitement, anxious to see whale and take our chances at capturing a few big fellows. We kept a sharp watch, but for nearly a week we did not see a whale. Then, as we were about to lose faith, our luck changed. Early one morning, sailing through a choppy sea, we heard the welcome cry from the crow's nest, "Ahoy, whale, on starboard bow." A few minutes later, we could see them from the deck. It was an enormous school of humpback whales, enough whalebone and whale oil to make a man rich. "All hands ahoy," I shouted. Peter Benjamin put his head down the booby hatch and repeated my order. The men scrambled to the deck, ready for the sport, and greatly surprised at the number of whales on our starboard. I now gave Peter Benjamin command of the ship, as he was an old and experienced whaler. We sailed as near as we dared, and then dropped anchor. His orders were not shouted now. "Stand by for whale boat," he said to his watch. Then quietly and quickly he told off the men going in the whale boats. Braithwaite was to handle the harpoon in one of the boats, and Benjamin himself in the other. Each of the boats had 4 of our best men at the oars. Each had a reliable coxswain. When the 2 boats were lowered, and the 6 men in each had taken their places, they proceeded with muffled oars to approach the school of whales. Those of us who were left aboard the ship watched the operations with great excitement. The whales were perhaps 200 yards from us, and seemed to be moving leisurely northward. The sea was so rough, and I doubted the ability of any man to draw a bead with the harpoon gun, but Braithwaite and Benjamin were old and experienced whalers, and had shot and thrown the harpoon in both the Pacific and Indian Oceans. They were not to be discouraged by a little thing like rough weather. Both men shot at the same instant. First we saw the smoke, and a moment later the report came over the water. There was a sudden commotion among the school of whales, and most of them were out of sight in a few seconds. We could easily see from the ship's deck that 2 of them would never again join their more fortunate fellows. Braithwaite had harpooned a fairly small cow, and after a 15-minute struggle drew his boat alongside his prey and killed it with a well-placed shot. Peter Benjamin, however, was having a tougher time of it. He had shot his harpoon into the biggest bull of the whole lot. The infuriated mammal rushed the little whaleboat, and would have broken it into 100 pieces, had it not been for the ability of the coxswain and the men at the oars, who were able to avoid the rush through great effort and dexterity. Then the whale sounded. It seemed as if nothing but the bottom would stop him as he went down and down. We could see Benjamin playing out the line, and we all hoped that he had a sufficient length. At last the whale went no deeper, but commenced to run, dragging the boat and its crew rapidly through the rough sea. I gave the command to up anchor, and we followed as closely as we could with the Pedro Gorino. We now had Braithwaite's whale in tow, but no one could foretell the outcome of Benjamin's struggle. At last, however, it became evident that the whale at the bottom of the sea was beginning to tire. A few minutes later, the lookout cried, There he blows. This moment was the most perilous of the whole fight, for the great bull rose so perpendicularly that he came to air almost beneath the whalers, and the wave of water from his body threw the men from their seats, and the small boat on her gunwale. The men righted the boat, however, and the struggle continued. It must have been a full half-hour later that Benjamin finished him with 3 shots. It is inadvisable to tow whales in these waters, as the sharks will soon gather. Now that the excitement was over, we were confronted with the job of cutting up the carcasses, which had been brought alongside, hoisting the chunks aboard, and reducing the blubber. Sidney Wilson superintended the disagreeable work of rendering the oil, and soon the crew were laboring in earnest. It was disillusioning, after the thrilling fight which had preceded. For several reasons I determined to end our whaling. The wind from up the channel continued to blow fitfully, making progress in that direction a long, hard fight. Time is precious to a ship owner, and he must take such things into consideration. The humpback whales found in this part of the Indian Ocean give only a small percentage of the oil that the so-called right whale gives, and with no such quality or value as the oil taken from the sperm whale. I saw that while whaling was an exciting and adventurous life, it could hardly net us half of what a successful year of trading would. Above all, I saw that while trading kept me in touch with the natives all along the coast of Africa, whaling precluded any such contacts, and therefore was a hindrance to my most important objectives. We put about and headed for Delagoa Bay, where we were fortunate in securing a full cargo and some 12 or 15 passengers. With these, and our more or less meager supply of sealskins, whale oil, and whalebone, we headed for Cape Town, and made a fast trip ahead of a stiff breeze. Chapter 14. The Black Archangel and His Sword of Fire. Bishop Levi Jenkins Copen, Generalissimo in the Legions of Christ, and pillar of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, was born the middle of last century on the eastern shore of Maryland to poor but devout parents. At an early age he was apprenticed to a wheelwright, and like his illustrious master learned the use of tools in shaping wood. While still a child he joined the church, where it was found that he was endowed with the love of God and obsessed with the Holy Ghost. He was one of the few Afro-American children in his neighborhood who learned to read and write, and before long he was teaching and advising those about him. After he had vanquished the devil on the eastern shore of Maryland, he went to Philadelphia, intent on new worlds to conquer. Here he met Fanny Jackson, my teacher and my mother's friend. This kind woman devoted her rare talent to his development, helped him to receive a university education, and to prepare for the ministry. After his graduation, he became the pastor of Bethel Church of Precious Memory. Thus, he spent most of his life in the very good cocoon of African Methodism. While pastoring at Bethel, the Reverend Mr. Coppen wrote many books and developed a ripe scholarship because he was in touch with some of the best minds in America at a city of brotherly love. At 40, he married his teacher, Fanny Jackson, who was easily 10 years his senior. She continued to help him with his studies, fully determined to make him a bishop. When at last he was rewarded and elected to the bishopric, the church decided to send him to South Africa to redeem that motley world and to organize a 14th episcopal district. On my return from the Straits of Mozambique, I learned for the first time of his approaching arrival. I was immediately interested, not only because he was the husband of my old friend and teacher, but because he was coming to aid the natives of South Africa. I determined to arrange for a suitable reception, and with this in mind, went to my old friend, F.Z.S. Peregrino, editor of the South African Spectator. He was more than willing to help me, and we too, with the aid of Reverend Mr. Go, a native clergyman and resident of Cape Town, began to make preparations. We were not the only ones awaiting the bishop's arrival with interest. The newspapers took note of it, as did the English in every station of life. These imperialists, realizing that they held their position through sheer physical power, watched with jealousy those spiritual and intellectual forces threatening their supremacy. They were not sure of his intention or purpose. It is certain that, understanding native psychology as they do, they realized that the bishop's position and type of work held a glamour for the Ethiopian mind, and that were he so inclined, he might arouse any one of a half-dozen tribes to rebellion. At this time, with the English forces occupied fighting the Bears, such trouble would have been embarrassing. Whatever their line of reasoning, it was evident that they were apprehensive and never once underestimated the importance of his arrival. When the bishop's boat came into the harbor, 6 of us met him at the dock. He arrived very unpretentiously, without so much as a secretary to help him with his voluminous writing. His voice was rich and clear, somewhere between a tenor and a bass. He had a stature to match his intellect. The reception was held in one of the better halls of Cape Town. It was attended by 2,000 or 3,000 people, fully half of whom were Europeans, and including in its numbers most of the government officials of Cape Town. Before them, on a dais of huge proportion, sat the bishop, 6 feet tall, dark brown, handsome, his intelligent face radiant with belief. We opened the meeting with song, and the bishop's voice, like Gabriel's silver trumpet, could be heard above the voices of the entire congregation. Peregrino gave the address of welcome. In reply, Bishop Coppin rose, lifted his throne-like seat, which must have weighed 150 pounds, high above his head, and shouted, "With such strength I have come to lift the impoverished natives of Africa from their lowly state, and to crush beneath my heel the so-called Christian who would keep his colored brother in darkness." Never since John the Baptist went crying through the wilderness, "Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand," has a man so moved those who heard him. His words penetrated to the very recesses of the dark and ancient forest, awaking the drowsing consciousness of Africa, asleep these thousands of years. More than one Englishman returned to his home, convinced of the bishop's power and secretly uneasy, half fearing the sword of vengeance. After the reception, the bishop, Reverend Mr. Gow, and I accompanied Peregrino to his home overlooking the bay. Bishop Coppin was stirred through and through by the reception and by the other experiences of his first days in South Africa. Always a poet and musician, he was moved to write the words to what has since become a famous African Methodist Episcopal hymn, Ethiopia, stretch forth thy hands. He wrote swiftly for 10 or 15 minutes, then turned to us and read that stirring song which begins, Stretch forth thy hands, what thou the heathen rage, and fiends of darkness all their wrath engage. The hand of God still writes upon the wall, Thy days are numbered, all the proud shall fall. Chapter 15. In the Hands of the Bears. When the bishop discovered my aims and ambitions in Africa, he began to realize how much we had in common, and our friendship grew daily. One afternoon, several weeks after his arrival, we were walking through the gardens. Our conversation turned to the pondos, and the bishop asked my advice on a puzzling situation. Segao Faku, king of the Pondos, had sent a messenger to the bishop begging for help in building and organizing schools and churches. The king was willing to do anything within his power to help his people, but he had been so impoverished by the imperialist that he was quite unable to accomplish his desired ends. It almost broke Bishop Coppen's heart, for he had neither the means nor the men to help these poor natives. As we walked, I realized that he had reached a solution. Brother Dean, has the Spirit ever moved you to join a flock? I had to admit that it had not. Surely you believe in the teachings of Jesus Christ. I hesitated a moment before replying that I inclined more toward Buddhism. This shocked and saddened the good bishop. But he continued, Yet, if the opportunity offered, you would sacrifice much for your race. I would do anything within my power, I said. Will you leave your business and go to Pondo land? I thought a full minute before answering. The bishop was playing upon a side of my nature which I had always considered the most human, my desire to help my race. There was, on the other hand, my profitable business, which might suffer from my absence. But why did you come to South Africa? I asked myself. Was it not to help the native? This, no doubt, was my big chance. What did business or anything else matter? I will go, I said. Later in the day, we met Mtinso, the ambassador to King Sego Faku. He was a small, wiry native with a fair command of English. He had been doing lay preaching in Pondo land for the last 3 or 4 years, and when the king had chosen him as a messenger to go to Cape Town to see the bishop, he had been more than willing. Mtinso's greatest desire was to be ordained. The bishop had complied with this native's wish. Several days before the afternoon of our meeting, Mtinso was overjoyed with his new title and told every one confidentially that he was a minister of the gospel. After we had parted with Mtinso, the bishop said, He will be your guide on the trip to Pondo land. God be with you both. I made all my arrangements as quickly as possible. I put my maritime affairs in the hands of Frater and Elliot. I put Peter Benjamin in charge of the Pedro Gorino, with Braithwaite as first mate, and gave explicit instructions. With the help of Mtinso, I purchased an outfit for the long trip. I secured credentials from the American Council and with great difficulty a military pass from the British government, signed by the English commander and the governor of Cape Colony. Finally, I bought tickets for Dakar, and we were ready to begin our journey. At last we boarded a train and were on our way. It is a little hard to explain why we went to the country of the Pondos overland and at great personal danger, when we could so much more easily have gone around by sea. It is true that Mtenso wished to visit a dozen or more little parishes on the way, but this was scarcely sufficient reason for our journey through disputed country in wartime. It may have been our love for adventure. More probable than either of these is a third explanation. We did not appreciate the dangers of war. In Cape Town we scarcely knew a war was being waged until De Wet made his advance. Yet Dakar, our present destination, was in danger of attack at any hour. Already the English had discontinued service by railroad. Beyond this point, already English troops were gathering to resist the Bears. We realized that after we reached Dakar, we must proceed by train in actual danger of capture by the enemy, yet we hardly gave it a second thought. Our only wish was that the train would travel faster. We shared our compartment with a woman of perhaps 50, who had, besides innumerable packages and a jar of marmalade, a big wicker basket full of kittens. Our other companion was a young English army officer. When the conductor came to take our tickets, he swore at Mtenso in Cape Dutch, and then asked, "What the hell you doin' in there with the white people?" Schwartz, Mtenso, being a meek and lowly follower of the Nazarene, did not know what to reply. The woman covered her ears and said, "Tut, tut, tut." The officer said, "It's all right." I shouted, "What do these tickets entitle us to? Our passage or your insults?" The kittens, hearing the commotion, upset their basket and the jar of marmalade. The conductor beat an ignoble retreat. When we at last disembarked at Dakar, Mtenso took me some distance up one of the little streets to where a man sat at the door of his cottage. After they had greeted each other in the native language, Mtenso informed me that this house was to shelter us until we took the trek train. After a dinner of mealies and kid meat, we went to view the town. We found it a very unpretentious village. Its inhabitants included several hundred Europeans, several hundred Cape-colored, and a large group of natives. We found a heavy British guard thrown about Dakar, with a regiment encamped on the outskirts. Finally we came to a great meadow, known as the Outspan. Here were numbers of huge covered wagons and many head of sleek oxen. Yokes were lying everywhere. Little half-naked Hottentot boys with sjambaks, whips of rhinoceros hide 40 feet long, ran here and there urging the oxen. Mtenso introduced me to several of the drivers and the boys about the meadow. Before we left, we learned that the trek train for the Karoo would leave at daybreak in the morning. We returned to the little house where we had left our luggage. and after another repast of mealies and kid meat, we put up for the night. At the break of day, with a great commotion and yelling and cracking of sjamboks, 12 wagons wheeled into line and prepared to take the trail northward across the Karoo. The trek men came noisily for our luggage and put it in the wagons. Mtinzo and I could have ridden, but since we were now on the high veld, the air was brisk, and we preferred to walk. I was fascinated with the skill of the drivers. Each of the enormous wagons was drawn by 16 powerful oxen, 8 pairs making a string well over 50 feet long. At the head of the column was a little native boy of 9 or 10, who trudged along leading the oxen. The driver on the wagon was so expert that though he was walking at the fore-wheel, he could snap flies off the ears of oxen well up the line with his long sjambok, and when he wished he could make the whip crack like the report of a gun. All day long, through a dry, dreary, and desert-like country, the oxen pulled the heavy wagons, creaking and groaning through the sand, up and down hills, across dried-up streamlets, through mountain passes, and on we labored. Nowhere was there a drop of water, only the dry stubble, a sad reminder of the rain months before. No living thing save the mimosa growth, and in the vast distance an occasional herd of antelope. These two clung tenaciously to life, the trees sending their roots far down to hidden moisture, the blesbok and springbuck moving swiftly out of range and disappearing against the protective landscape. Fortunately, we had cool water, for each of us had taken with us a large square canvas bag with a mouthpiece at one end. These bags had been filled and hung on the outside of the wagons, where the wind had full play upon them. Thus, through the slight evaporation which was continually taking place from their surfaces, our water was always ice-cold. It was well after dark when we pitched camp for the night. The wagons were drawn into a circle, and the oxen were tethered. The boys who had led the oxen gathered brush and lit a fire. Soon the coffee was boiling, and the mealies simmering. Those who so desired reclined on their karosses, robes of skin. The guards were posted against hyenas, leopards, or an occasional lion. Within the circle of the wagon, the fire lit the faces of our companions. We might have been within a room, except that high above us the cold stars sparkled. The Africanados are good storytellers, and I sat up far into the night listening. Their language, which is an admixture of broken English, Dutch, and native words and phrases, is at first hard to understand. It has a rough music that holds one's attention even where it cannot be understood. The main difficulty is to catch the individual words, as a whole sentence comes in one breath. The profanity they have picked up from the English is no longer profane, but is merely used for emphasis. One of the stories concerning the defeat of a braggart, which threw the Africanados into convulsions of laughter, ran something like this. One helluba brawn, brain mon fight, every mon to damn match. He put sack of impops, mealies, native grain, on back and tell everybody, you lick me, you take impops. One lazy mon hereabout, he say, I whip you. One helluba brawn, brain mon say, all right, fight you tomorrow mornin', betcha hat lazy. Lazy mon, go to him boy, and tell him, boy, if brain mon hit me 3 times, good lick run like the devil. All right, say boy, next mornin' fight. Helluba big one, hit lazy mon 2 good lick, knock down. Lazy mon cry, boy time come. Boy say, wait, dat no 3 good lick. Wait him give you 1 more. Brain mon say to self, lazy wait me, give him 1 more lick. Gonna kill maybe, got a knife in sterlerim, breech clout. Maybe. Better run, helluba big one get scared, run. Leave 'em pop for lazy mon. At the conclusion of this story, most of the audience shouted, Ikuna, meaning it is truth, or I understand. One among them, however, cried, Guthly, meaning I doubt it, or go on with you. His remark was merely a matter of form, and really signified that he had a story to tell, which he considered infinitely more entertaining. On this particular occasion, it was further adventures of the Brain Mon. It recounted how after he had gone to market and purchased the head of a bull for 15 shillings, the Brain Mon carried his purchase far out on the veld and placed it in the mud, so that it seemed as if an entire bull were sunk in the mud, with nothing but his head above. Then this wily son of Satan had offered several men who were passing 5 shillings if they would help him pull his bull out of the mud. The men had pulled and the head had come loose, whereupon the Brain Mon had told them that they would either have to pay him £5 for killing his bull, or come before the magistrate. The people were so frightened that, unbelievable as it may seem, they paid the £5. When I finally rolled up in my carouse, it must have been midnight. The karoo was quiet, without a wind, the air cool and clear. For a few minutes I lay awake, thinking of the nearness of the war, and wondering a little at the unconcern of the drivers. Then, since I was very tired and drowsy, I dropped to sleep. The next morning we were up early. We prepared breakfast before daybreak, to the accompaniment of cracking sajambaks and creaking wheels. All through the day we labored through country of the same desert-like nature as the day before. Only one who has crossed this country can realize its dangers and difficulties. Often there were mirages to bewilder the unaccustomed eye, and occasionally we came upon long stretches where the trail was completely obliterated. Our drivers, however, were experienced freighters and knew the route well. They made remarkably good time, all things considered. That evening at dusk we pulled into a small town, where we planned to spend the night. We had just succeeded in drawing the wagons into a circle, when from every direction mounted men thundered down upon us out of the half-light. "The bears!" someone shouted, but it was too late to resist. A bear detachment under Captain Wessel had occupied the town that very day, and we had driven into the camp of our enemy, all unaware of our danger. Captain Wessel was among us in person. He addressed us in perfect English. "Your arms, gentlemen." The drivers, who were badly frightened, complied readily, even hunting for the guns among our luggage. Fortunately, they missed my 2 Colts, my rifle, and my shotgun, packed away with my other things in one of the wagons. Captain Wessel was a man of perhaps 40 years of age. He was 6 feet tall, with raven black hair, and a strong, hard face. His skin was dark enough so that he would have been taken for a quadroon in America. He was dressed in khaki pants, puttees, and short boots of dove-colored buckskin, a bandana handkerchief about his neck, and a broad-brimmed felt hat like that worn by a Texas cowboy completed the picture. He was armed with a .45 rifle, which was slung about his back, 2 pistols at his side, and a great cartridge belt around his waist. Satisfied that he had confiscated all our guns, he remounted and rode away with most of his company, leaving 20 mounted men to guard us. Thus we remained all night, unable to leave our camp, under penalty of being shot.